Hey everyone, I'm Michael Palmyre, the Consumer Experience Lead at the Data Standards body. I've been involved in CDR since 2018, and in the CX team, we're a team of 7 of designers and researchers who have been involved in CDR for a while. What we ultimately get involved in is consumer experience research to inform standards development, guidelines development that I'll speak to in a moment, and also at times to provide an input to inform rules and policy development. So what we have here, and I'll just kind of quickly run through it, is what a consumer might see when they're interacting with the CDR. And what we have here is a guideline kind of put into effect as a prototype. So this demonstrates the consent, authenticate, and authorize aspects of that consent flow. The first, I guess, part of the consent flow is actually this bit where an ADR, a data recipient, asks the consumer for consent to actually collect and use that. So this is what an ADR may present to a consumer, and I'll get into the detail of what these things are in a moment, but effectively a data recipient in the consent step is asking a consumer for consent to collect and use specific data sets for a specific duration and for a specific purpose. And so this is where a consumer might actually see the kind of the legislation, rules, and standards being put into effect. And it could look something like this potentially, where they're shown the periods that they're going to be collecting and using that data, for example, and also, I guess, the terms of that consent. So a dashboard, a data recipient or data holder one, to actually manage those consents or authorizations, and how that data might be handled when the data recipient no longer requires it to provide them with that service, for example. This is all in the data recipient space. When you hit consent, it jumps over, and this is now, as you can see in the top there, in the data holder space. So this is the authentication step, where a consumer might put in a unique user identifier, and then they receive a one-time password here to input into that authentication flow that's provided by that data holder. After they're authenticated, they may choose the accounts that they wish to share, and this may differ depending on the sector. Obviously, this prototype is banking specific. And then there's just effectively a confirmation page to show what it is that they are authorizing to share from that data holder with the data recipient. And that's the end of that flow. But just a kind of quick overview there, because I think it's a useful way in to what the consumer experience working group actually tends to, and kind of what that looks like as well. So what I'll do now is I'll go over first the consumer experience standards, and then I'll jump here into the consumer experience guidelines in a moment. So it's worth, I guess, differentiating those things. The consumer experience standards, as James, as Jared, and as Wendy noted, they're mandatory requirements. So they are data standards. They're listed here on the standards website, similar to the technical standards, and they are required. They're mandatory obligations. They're binding. There are obviously aspects where the nomenclature is must, and there's also shoulds and mays, and we can get into that in a moment. But ultimately, the CX standards are binding. The CX guidelines are slightly different. They are referred to in the rules as something that CDR participants must have regard to. They demonstrate examples. They provide implementation possibilities for CDR participants to put key rules, requirements, standards and recommendations and best practice into effect, but they're not mandatory. The CX standards ultimately deal with requirements relating to consumer interactions, information that may be presented to a consumer, or even requirements about how requirements ought to be met. The most obvious one is the data language standards. So those are standards relating to descriptions of data. So I'll scroll down here, but when a consumer in that previous prototype, for example, is presented with a request from a data recipient, or even an authorization request from a data holder, they are presented with a data set that a data recipient would like access to, for example. The data language standards provide requirements around, what language to use, how to describe that actual data set. And on the right here is a visual example of this first instance here, transaction details, which we refer to as a data cluster. And then this additional detail here, which we refer to as permissions. And ultimately, this is, as the name suggests, a cluster of data. So transaction details is effectively the grouping, but there's additional detail in here that a consumer could dial into, for example, that provides a bit more information on what is actually included in this data cluster. And that's really important because when consent is a key aspect of the consumer data right, and for a consumer to be informed as to what they're consenting to, they need to understand what the data actually relates to, what information about themselves they're actually sharing. So this is quite a critical component of consent because it ultimately comes down to the level of comprehension that a consumer can have. We have different data language standards based on the sector. So the banking sector, for example, we have this language here that is specific to banking data. And again, here we've got data cluster language, and that's what the consumer would see at the kind of first order level, and the permission language, which is what they would see if they wanted to dial into the detail a little bit more. And on the right side here, we have the authorization scopes. So this basically refers to the technical standards and what this language maps to. When an ADR is requesting access to this authorization scope, this is the language that they must use to present to the consumer. There are different examples here for banking, obviously, different data clusters, different authorization scopes, and that is sector specific. Energy as well, these standards were made binding in December. There are some commonalities across sectors. So customer data, for example, the authorization scopes are the same. They're common across sector. But following the rules, there are some potential differences where there might not be as much information required in the rules for the energy sector compared to banking. We will have language that is specific to the telecommunication sector. For example, the accessibility standards, where we do specify some elements of WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and there is flexibility here, what I mentioned earlier about must versus shoulds and so on, and also some of the wording there. There is flexibility acknowledging that there may be times when these standards can't be complied with, so that's where a should and so on might be raised there. And there also might be some aspects, which is why we have must seek to, where it's not practical to actually apply these there because it might not be a digital channel, for example. So that's one example of, standards that apply to both data recipients and data holders, and the application of those different obligation levels. This section refers, I believe, entirely to data recipients, and these provide additional requirements there in relation to how to actually comply with specific rules requirements, how to present information, what information to present, and so on. So there are different kinds of consent to collect, use, disclosure consents, and so on. So we have also different areas that we're tending to in the consent standards, some that apply broadly to consent where authentication must occur, and also different things that might apply to disclosure consent, descriptions specifically for insight disclosures, and also where disclosures may occur to a non-accredited person, for example. Authorization standards, they refer here strictly to data holders because they provide the authorization flow. It occurs in their space. It's not an obligation that falls on data recipients. So the rules when it comes to the authorization flow prohibit data holders providing additional information or requirements in the authorization flow. So some of these standards are quite straightforward musts. They are requirements on data holders to provide information here. But when we get to, for example, these examples down here with unavailable accounts, we see a lot of shoulds and mays. So there aren't, strictly speaking, these aren't requirements that must be implemented. We're not requiring data holders to do these things, and also how those obligations work in slightly different ways depending on how they're phrased. I won't work through all of these, but I will jump straight to the withdrawal standards here. So Wendy mentioned the dashboards, so data recipient, data holder dashboards. And in this section here, we have withdrawal standards. There's obviously a significant focus and emphasis on consent being provided, but another significant aspect of the CDR is consent management. So that's another aspect where a consumer has control over what they share, and a fundamental aspect of consent being the ability to withdraw that consent. For example, authorization, data holder space on data holder dashboards, consent, data recipient in a data recipient dashboard. And also some sharing functionality on the data holder side relating to joint accounts, secondary users, and so on. So not just individual consumers. Data holder, for example, may not know what the service impacts are if that authorization is withdrawn. And so some examples that might be provided by a data holder is to actually check with that data recipient first to make sure that they understand the consequences, and also to alert them to the fact that a service may actually be impacted if they stop sharing that data with the data recipient.